Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. The Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We protect the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, and the Shanks Ferry people, and it's my hope that we care for these lands as well as these native peoples. For more than 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these beautiful places by removing invasives, installing trails, planting trees and meadows. These preserves are then open for you and I to use to hunt, hike, fish, and birdwatch 365 days per year. Special places like Shanks Ferry, Clark, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation with 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll include your questions as part of the conversation. This is the third lecture of our 25-26 winter season. Our next Nature Hour, How to Love a Forest, with award-winning author Ethan Tapper, will be on January 22nd. You can learn more and pre-register for this lecture and other events on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, who include the Wenger Group, J Group, Apex Advertising, Clark Associates, Nimblist, Electron Energy, Eurofins, Dart Container, Moravian Manor, Armstrong, Richards Energy Group, Lancaster Civil, Commonwealth Financial Associates, PP&L, Cargis, CH&E, and Penstone. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Wildlife Research on Lancaster Conservancy Preserves with Dr. Dan Ardia. Dan Ardia is a professor of biology at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster. He studies how birds and mammals respond to rapid environmental change, conducting studies in Lancaster and all over the world. Dan is active in the ornithological community and has served in a variety of leadership roles within the Association of Field Ornithologists and the American Ornithological Society. He's also on our board. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Dan Ardia.
Thanks so much, Keith. Let me share my slides. Can you see me? Perfect. So thanks again to Keith and the Lancaster Conservancy for inviting me to come talk with you tonight. And I want to walk you through some of the studies that I've been doing on Lancaster Conservancy preserves in collaboration with my friends and colleagues at the Lancaster Conservancy, as well as a host of other community partners and my students. So first, I just want to start by stating some obvious things, which is why would we care about studying wildlife? People like wildlife, but studying wildlife does more than just pique our interest. It gives us insights into the ecological health of our ecosystems and communities, of understanding ecosystem services, which might benefit us directly, and of course, out of a sense of ethical obligation. So wildlife face sort of three types of threats, many more, but I like to frame them for my students and myself as sort of three important impacts that influence wildlife around us, influence us as well. The first is climate change. So we see lots of effects of climate change that affect wildlife and our ecosystems. Changes in temperature, usually getting warm, unpredictability. So as we know, sometimes we have dry seasons that are longer and drier. Some winters we get no snow, other winters we get huge storms. So not only is weather warming, it's becoming more extreme and more unpredictable. And that has shifts in the suitable ranges and niche for species, as well as the timing of their behaviors and reproduction. Urbanization plays important roles. So I asked AI to make me a figure. I described what I thought the effects of urbanization, important effects would be. So things like direct effects, like people hitting wildlife on the roads, humans on trails, as well as indirect effects like noise pollution, sound pollution, toxics, things. And this is the crazy figure that AI came up for me. So climate change, urbanization, And then, of course, changes in habitat. And we can think about changes in habitat from kind of two perspectives. One are changes in habitat quality. So I have a figure here that shows sort of what we would expect an intact functional forest in Pennsylvania to look like. And it has multiple layers of structure. Each of those layers of structure, from the forest floor, shrubs, understory, canopy, emergent trees, each have different organisms that are adapted to it. They're working together in ways for which they've co-evolved. And the lack of one of these layers have effects. And so this is what we might aspire to, but because of things like overbrowsing by deer, the invasive species, a whole variety of impacts, we see changes in not just the amount of habitat, but in the quality of that habitat. But of course, we see changes in the amount as well. And in particular, habitat becomes fragmented. So fragmentation is when a larger habitat gets broken into smaller pieces. And so here's just a little schematic. You could imagine a large forest block could maintain a number of species. And then as it gets bisected by human activities, it becomes smaller. By becoming smaller, it changes the quality. And so here's a more scientific diagram. So you could imagine a habitat, if you looked at it from above, to have this darker space that we would consider interior forest that might show most of the characteristics of a healthy forest. And then areas along the edge, which are still forested, but are experiencing impacts from the landscape that surrounds it. It might be changes in temperature, changes in wind, and predators, invasive species. And so then as that habitat gets fragmented, the amount of high quality interior forest goes down. So these are the kinds of things that impact wildlife. We would see effects of climate change, effects of urbanization, and effects of habitat fragmentation. So here's a map of forest land in the state of Pennsylvania. And if you look in the corner where Lancaster County is, and York as well, you can see not a lot of green in Lancaster. It's by the best metrics I can find, it's the least forested county in the state by percentage, in part because it's relatively flat, and most of it is agricultural or developed. And so that means that an animal that likes forest has very few places it can find successful habitat to breed. So here's just another way to visualize the county of Lancaster. So this is from LiDAR, which is just surface radar that the government shares. That is a very common way to visualize land use. So the red areas are those that are developed at different levels of intensity. The brown areas are agriculture or open space like hay or pasture. And then the greener areas are different types of forest. So what you can take from this is, first, there isn't a lot of forest. Where there is forest, it's concentrated in very specific places, and that most of that forest is fragmented. So why should we be managing? How, or what would be some of the metrics that we might use to know we were doing a good job in managing for wildlife in Lancaster and York counties? First would be to maintain for species diversity. Biodiversity is just a fancy term for having lots and lots of species, not just lots of different species, but lots of numbers of those species. So that could be one thing we would aspire to management to. Another would be to manage for ecological function. And so if we think about the functions that are found in a healthy ecosystem, that might be things like herbivory and predation. They might be things like denitrification or changing nitrogen from the soil and putting it into plants, evapotranspiration, photosynthesis, decomposition, all of the sort of pieces that are part of a complex ecosystem. And those functions play a role in maintaining ecosystem health. And that could be something we would manage for. If we find that those functions are not there, we can try to choose our management in order to restore those functions. And ecosystem function is very strongly linked with what we might consider ecosystem resilience. And so resilience is the ability of a system to recover from a disturbance to get back to what the state of that system was. And so on the left-hand side of this figure is just an idea of what a forest ecosystem, a functioning forest ecosystem might look like, and some of the characteristics that we would see in a functioning ecosystem. So high diversity of genetics within species, a lot of species, a lot of ability to evolve, a lot of growth, just a vibrant system. And then it might be disturbed in some way, and those disturbances could be things like weather related or climate related, like wind or heat waves or drought. And again, that goes back to the point I made earlier about how climate change has exacerbated the extreme nature of disturbances. Those disturbances could be from pests or pathogens, whether they be invasive or not, and that would knock the system back. So we could go and measure that forest and find that some of its function or characteristics are not what they were when we thought it was healthy. And so resilience is the ability for it to recover that function. And so that's a key thing we should be managing for. It doesn't necessarily say we should have species X or Y, but if species X or Y helps maintain that resilience, that ability to recover, then that would be something to aspire to. So how might we achieve these goals? What are the ways that people managing lands like Lancaster Conservancy in particular might be using in order to increase and maintain biodiversity, to keep ecological function strong, and to manage for ecosystem resilience? Well, sort of three key ways we might do that is one, to maintain large forest blocks. So I talked about how forest fragmentation takes high quality interior habitat and breaks it into smaller pieces that then are lower in quality as well as overall size. So maintaining large forest blocks can be a way to do that. So this is a map from We Conserve Pennsylvania of all the protected lands in Lancaster and York counties. You can see again that they're not distributed equally across the county, and in general, they tend to be small. And if we look at other parts of the state that tend to have topography that has resisted agricultural development, they tend to have much larger blocks of forest. So managing for as large as possible blocks of forest is one way in order to manage for biodiversity, function, and resilience. Another way to do that is through landscape connectivity. This little graphic, which we won't have time to unpack, shows us the various ways in which connecting ecosystems can allow organisms, plants, and animals to move between them and to exchange genes, to allow for dispersal and reproduction. And there's lots of different ways that land managers can think about how to manage for connectivity. The third way is to actively restore habitat. And one theme I hope you take from my talk today is that Lancaster Conservancy is leading the charge among land trusts and being willing and able to do dynamic habitat management and stewardship. And that involves doing dynamic things like cutting some trees down in order to change species composition, or to do, in this case, a prescribed burn out at Wizard Ranch. And so active, thoughtful habitat restoration can help reset the deck in order to maintain ecosystem function or restore it, which can make ecosystems more resilient. So, okay. So I want to talk through a couple of research projects that I'm doing on Lancaster Conservancy preserves in collaboration with Lancaster Conservancy staff to think about how we might address or understand these questions about how wildlife are distributed. So what drove me about 10 years ago was to mostly focus on how landscape scale affected the kinds of species that we saw, both the distribution, where we found them, and the abundance, the number that we might see. And my original framing of this project was to think about how wildlife was distributed across the landscape on three different scales. So we might think on a site level scale, like if we took a point in a forest, like where we might, for example, place a trail camera and ask, how do factors within a couple hundred meters of that camera affect what we see? Is it close to a stream? Is it on or off a trail? Is the forest young or old? What's the species composition? Is it on a ridge? Is it exposed to grassland? So you could imagine sort of small scale micro habitat factors playing a role. Then we could think on what we might call the patch level, on a preserve level. Is the preserve large or small? Is it large and shaped in a way that minimizes the amount of edge, or is it long and thin where there might be a lot of edge effects? And then, of course, where does that patch fit in the landscape? Is it surrounded by development or agriculture or by grassland? And so you can imagine sort of if you measure a lot of things about wildlife and then ask what are the factors that best predict what we see, how much of it's due to small site level factors, how much of it's due to patch level factors, and how much of it is due to landscape level factors. So I've done this work by putting up motion activated trail cameras across preserves since 2016. So here's one that you see, whoops, on a tree out at Clark Nature Preserve up along the ridge. If I do a good job, you don't see them. Sometimes that's hard to do because sometimes there's just no good places, and lots of my cameras are placed off trails. Many of the cameras are placed on trails because wildlife use trails. Many trails that humans form are in places that wildlife have used because they're following the topography to minimize energy use. And we've done studies where we place cameras at random points in the forest and then on a trail and found very distinctly that animals use trails. So if you want to study wildlife, you need to put cameras up along trails. And trails, as you'll see later, are used by wildlife during periods of time when people aren't around. So we place these cameras out there. And so I want to walk you through just a little bit of the process by which we extract data from that. So we place about 850 camera placements, not 850 cameras themselves, but cameras we've returned to over time, over the years. And so we collect those data and we do a lot of research computing work on that. So I want to give a shout out to my colleagues, Tony Weaver and Jason Brooks here at Franklin Marshall College that run what they call DORC, the Department of Research Computing. And they've been great collaborators in helping me use conservation technology tools, primarily machine learning and AI systems in order to process these data. So what do? I take the data back from the field and I upload them to our research server where they get run through a deep learning, a machine learning AI program called PyTorch. This is a program that Microsoft shares with the community. It's an image detector that's been used in a wide number of wildlife studies. And so what it can do is it can sort the pictures into two general categories, animal and not animal. And so the first thing to say, these are pictures of me in the field. That's me, my wife, a couple of my students, my dog. That we don't look at the pictures of people. There's way too many of them that no one would even want to do that. They get sorted by the computer and stored in files. And so what we extract from this is essentially a bunch of rows in a spreadsheet that gives us a detection that notes the location, the time, the date, and what the detector thought it was, whether it was an animal or a non-animal. We then take the animal pictures, and so here are just some examples here, and I'm going to go through some of the species that we see. I'm not going to mention cats because they're not wild, but we see a lot of cats. And so public service message, keep your cats indoors. If you love birds, keep your cat inside, no matter what you think, whether your cat is catching or killing birds, it is. And so if you really care about birds, your cat needs to be inside. Don't feed feral cats. It's just, there's an enormous amount of evidence. I'd be happy to engage with you another time. Keep your cats inside. So we take these animal pictures and then we classify them by hand using a program called time lapse. And it's a tedious process. We've been through, I don't know, about 400,000 animal pictures. That's about maybe a third of them. So this is a tedious, laborious process where we collect images in the field. They get processed through a machine learning AI tool and sorted into people, which we don't look at, but just look at the summaries and then the animals. And so one thing that's impeded our ability to be able to tell a full story from this is getting the technological process solved. So just in the last 6 months, we've worked out some kinks and we're really rolling along now on building our own classifier, essentially identifying species in the pictures and then looping them back in order to then train our own classifier model. So I say we because I've done this work in collaboration with my students over the last 10 years. And so here are just some pictures of them all caught on the game cameras as they set the cameras up in the field. It's a great way to train Franklin and Marshall students on how to design and conduct research studies, about how to be safe in the field, about how to manage data, and how to test research questions. So what have we found? Well, the first thing to say is that most forest-sensitive species are already gone from Lancaster and York counties, and I'm going to come back in a little bit to talk about what those are. So we find some species that are common in almost all the habitats in which we look, and there are none of them. These are going to be surprising. White-tailed deer are everywhere. Red fox, coyotes, and eastern gray squirrels. So, of course, deer are everywhere. Their patterns are interesting, and I'll loop back in a minute and talk about how people affect deer. Red fox seem to be found in every kind of habitat that they could be in. Talk a little bit about coyotes. So I've been here in Lancaster for about 20 years. From what I understand, they were not found much in Lancaster County, but they have been moving their way south. And so here's just a couple images. This is a range map from some studies looking at coyote genetics. And so you can see that the coyotes have expanded their way down from the north and from the south and are moving across the state. And then in the bottom right corner is a figure from iNaturalist, where you can see the number of coyote sightings have gone up. And even though the number of iNaturalist sightings have gone up, the number of coyote sightings have gone up in Pennsylvania, disproportionate. So they're moving around in the state and people are seeing them much, much more. So, okay. So then there's some species that are common, but only in what we might call edge habitats. So these are the parts of a forest that are close to agriculture or development. And those would be, again, nothing you'd be surprised at: raccoons, woodchucks, cottontail rabbits, and Virginia possum. So what I mean by saying they're common in edge habitats, that if you take a big preserve like Welsh Mountain and you go to the center of it, which is mostly interior forest, you tend not to see a lot of raccoons or possums. But if you go to the edge, especially of a smaller preserve like Boyer or Shiprock, you'll see raccoons everywhere because most of it is edge habitat. Then there are species that we pick up occasionally, and they could be picked up occasionally either because they themselves are rare, so there are not very many of them in the forest, or because they have very restricted habitat preference. And so here's just some examples. So we occasionally pick up a black bear, and I'll talk about bear in a second. The gray fox, which is a much more forest dependent species. Flying squirrels are actually much more abundant than we think. They just often don't move around a lot, so we don't pick them up on the cameras. A number of different species of the weasel family, so short and long-tailed weasels, river otters, which I'll show a picture of in a minute, and mink. Mink are quite common in the habitats in which mink are found. So these are species that are picked up less frequently. So we do pick up otters in places like Trout Run. I'd love to be able to get more otters, and we're going to try to deploy cameras along streams for the purpose of picking up otters. It looks like as water quality has gone up, and I hear anecdotally that people see otters along the Conestoga much more frequently than they did in the past. So the gray fox is an important species as part of the story. It's mostly a forest interior species, and so it could be a good target for management because a good healthy population of gray fox needs a large block of forest. So I'm going to talk in a second about Hawk Mountain, but I just want to show this video. This is a gray fox from Hawk Mountain. It can give you a sense. So this is a much more forest dwelling tree climbing fox than a red fox. So it has a very different morphology, almost cat-like. So here you can see it go by again. So these are just some images from, this is a picture of a gray fox that I didn't take. And then here are just some sightings from my naturalist of gray foxes. Now, of course, any kind of citizen science uh, site like iNaturalist is a function in part of people's going to places where you might see them, but you can see they're relatively rare. And we do pick them up occasionally in Lancaster Conservancy cameras. And so, as I said, it could be a good target species for management to know that forests have been restored to be larger and healthier if we pick up gray fox. We also occasionally pick up black bear. There's no evidence that there's a vibrant population of breeding black bear in any of the sites that we work, even in the Lancaster Lebanon Highlands, but they're primarily using habitat on the northern edge of Lancaster County as movement. And that photo is from Hawk Mountain, and I'll talk about Hawk Mountain in a second. So if we want to get a sense for what species we're missing, we might aspire to. I also do work up at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which if you haven't been there, you should. It's a wonderful large forest block along the Kittatinny Ridge. It's connected to a number of other forests. So my students and I have been deploying cameras there for the last 5 years or so. And so let's look at some of the differences between what we see at Hawk Mountain and what we see in Lancaster. And again, I frame this as forest communities we should aspire to. So the great red fox is very common at all sites in Lancaster County. It's common on the periphery of Hawk Mountain, or the red fox, sorry. Gray fox, common at Hawk Mountain. We rarely see it in Lancaster County. Bobcat, it's uncommon at Hawk Mountain because it's rare. I've not yet picked one up on a camera in Lancaster. The fisher, which I'll talk about in a second, uncommon because it's a rare species, but it's there breeding. We don't pick it up in Lancaster County. Black bear, very common at Hawk Mountain. I pick that up often, very rare in Lancaster County. The porcupine, also uncommon, but found at Hawk Mountain, not found in Lancaster County. So let's talk a minute about some of those species we might be able to manage for. So the fisher is a large forest dwelling member of the weasel family. Pennsylvania Game Commission has been working to restore fisher in part because people trap them. So this is a relatively old map, but that's still pretty current, that shows us places in the north and western part of the state in which we see fisher, but we have not yet picked it up in Lancaster. But again, it's close up on Hawk Mountain at the intersection between Berks and Schuylkill County. They might wander their way down, but the key is to have forest healthy enough that when fisher come down, that they'll find it suitable. The bobcat is another species that we're not picking up in Lancaster County, but is increasing in the state. That could be another one to manage for. So, okay. Just a quick little video from Hawk Mountain of a bobcat to get you excited about the idea of bobcats in Lancaster. Look at that. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so what are some findings that we found from the mammals part of this? So I mentioned in the beginning, I started this project by thinking, what are the landscape, site, and patch level effects of wildlife? A very common ecological study, mostly focused on wildlife. But what I found is this really a story about people on the landscape. So if you think about, here's a map of Steinman Run, a portion of the preserve has trails and a portion of the southern section there does not. So what might be the impacts of people on trails, on wildlife? Well, wildlife could have no effect. They could shift where they use habitat, so they could show a spatial effect by shifting, as I show them with that arrow, to southern parts of the preserve where there aren't people, or they could change their time of activity to be more nocturnal when people aren't there. So they use the same space, but they show a temporal change. So what we found are two big trends. First, that heavy human use causes some species, particularly deer and red fox, to be more active at night. So places like Kelly's Run that are visited all the time, you almost never see deer on the cameras during the day. You'll only see them at night. But if you go to places like Christ Nature Preserve, which has a healthy deer population, but very few people visit, about 25% of the day you see deer out, or 25% of the time they're active during the day. We also see a very strong effect of dogs, and I need to expand this again when we get this classifier together, that places that get a lot of dogs cause some species, particularly deer and red fox, to show spatial. So they, instead of just shifting their activity at night, they just move to other parts of the preserves. I love my dog. That's a picture of my dog down there on a leash, I'll note, but dogs do have effects. So. Okay, so what are the next steps for this project? And as I'll walk you through briefly what it is we're aspiring to do more of, there's just a little animation down there of a coyote putting a scent mark down in the snow. So the first thing we need to do is achieve a reliable classifier. We need to be able to take these millions of animal images and without having to do it by hand, be able to use this machine learning AI tool to be able to tell us this is this species. The next step, once we have that, would be to test habitat-related factors, so to best understand some on the management level, and in particular, the Conservancy is very far-thinking in terms of having some preserves that are primarily for recreation and others that they call habitat preserves that people don't visit as frequently, and to see by controlling for different forest types whether or not reduced human activity on the trails, especially dogs, has an impact on wildlife. As I mentioned, connectivity across preserves is quite important. And so I think it's important as next steps to think about how to assess connectivity. So there's a number of ways to do that. You can use some genetics by collecting hair samples and see whether there's movement. You can look at genetic diversity. And then ideally, we also hope to be able to possibly put radio collars on animals and see whether they move from place to place. So, and then to get a better, more nuanced understanding of human impacts. So I want to talk about my second project before I open it up for questions, and that relates to birds. As you heard in the introduction, my primary area of expertise is in birds. I've been studying birds for 30 plus years. I love birds. I'm active in the ornithological community, and birds are great for many reasons. One, they're good to study because they're very sensitive to environmental change. They're very strongly impacted by habitat, by changes in climate. I do a lot of work on the climate of physiology adaptation. That's not this project I'm talking about, because birds are very sensitive to that. Because they're very seasonal, they can be good indicators. So if you think about wintering and migratory birds versus breeding birds, they occupy a wide range of niches that make them very useful for understanding management. They have high functional importance in various ways, including seed dispersal, for example, insect control. And they're pretty well studied. So there's lots of good metrics out there that we can use to compare management here versus management in other places. So, and of course, people love birds. And so I want to talk about three separate projects using birds. The first is using birds as a way to understand habitat restoration. The second is as a part of management planning. And the third might be how can we use birds to understand long-term monitoring and health of preserves. So just as at the stage, I mentioned that the Conservancy has been very active with habitat restoration. And so this is a picture from Safe Harbor, it's my student Veronica Thompson. And so grassland birds are one of the groups of birds that are most impacted. And so the 3 Billion Birds Project at Cornell is a great website. This is an image captured from that shows that grassland birds have declined by 53%. So this is really a group of birds that's struggling. Safe Harbor Nature Preserve, if you've ever been out there, is a big open field, and the Conservancy has been actively restoring it to turn it into grassland bird habitat. And so one way that birds can be great is to study pre versus post effects. So what Veronica and I did is work with Eric Roper, the forester for Lancaster Conservancy, before the restoration took place. And we chose a number of spots and went out and put audio recorders out to see what birds were using Safe Harbor before the restoration. And so this just shows you some examples of how we've expanded this and used acoustic recorders as a way to study birds. And so what acoustic recorders are, they're just essentially little circuit boards with a microphone that you can program and place out in the woods. And they can be programmed to turn on during dawn chorus. They record during that period of time, and then we can use a different machine learning tool in order to try to parse out what species are singing. So it's a great way to get long periods of data from all across the forest. And so after we bring those, we again process those through the through F&M's research server. So again, a shout out to my colleagues at the Department of Research Computing. And so we use an algorithm that Cornell shares called BirdNet, and then that creates a selection table. It's not great. It's got about an 85% accuracy. So we need to go through and validate that ourselves. And that's what we're in the process of doing now. So what are some of the data we found? Well, here are just some examples of the species that we picked up from Safe Harbor in 2021 and 2022. So it already was harboring a pretty diverse set of birds, which was great. So it shows you, in a sense, how desperate grassland birds are that they could use a big pasture, which is fine, but it's not as diverse as a restored grassland. And so we've been out now and placed loggers this past year in 2025, and we'll do it again next year as the restoration is more active, then wait another 3 years and deploy it again. So it's a great way to understand how habitat restoration as a management tool, to go back to the 3 things I mentioned in the beginning, we should be managing for biodiversity, for ecological function, and for ecosystem resilience. Understanding how birds respond can give us insights into that. Been actively working in collaboration with Lancaster Conservancy on a land management planning process, the Lancaster River Hills Conservation Area. And so this is a map of those 8 preserves, which many of you might be familiar with, like Kelly's Run and Tuckwan Glen, Fox Hollow, Shanks Ferry. And so working in collaboration with Sarver Ecological, who did an ecological assessment. And so we placed these audio recorders in 2024 and 2025. This is a map that shows the 2024 recordings. Those are the ones in yellow. And so these were sprinkled across preserves, stratified by different habitat types. Again, they're recording the birds that they hear. We process them using a variety of tools, and then we can get preliminary estimates of the species that we find. And so here's just a map, for example, at Clark. We have some of the loggers placed close to open space, others of them along riparian areas, and some of them in dense forest. And what we get are tables that look like this. So each of these detections is a song. It's not an individual. So there could be an individual wood thrush that sings next to the recorder, for hours on end. And so we have to use a variety of techniques to try to parse that, but it gives us a pretty good sense of what birds are active and breeding at these sites. So here's another way to visualize the data. And so along the top edge here, are some different preserves and then the species that we pick up. So it generates a lot of very, very interesting data. And so what are some key take homes? Well, the first thing to say is that excitingly, we found a number of Pennsylvania species of greatest conservation need that are breeding in Lancaster Conservancy preserves. So that tells us that the forests right now are doing a pretty good job for these species. And so, for example, things like wood thrush and scarlet tanager, which need big blocks of forest, Louisiana water thrush, which need riparian areas, they're doing well. We're picking them up, they're breeding. And so we can sort of divide these birds into sort of 2 general categories of habitat use: forest dwelling birds like the ones at the top, and then birds that are using shrubby areas that are a mix of shrubs and grassland and small trees are also thriving. And so that sort of reinforces the idea that if we're managing lands for biodiversity, we need to manage lands for different kinds of habitat. And so bird species tend to show very particular types of habitat that have different ages along succession. And so if one wants to have the widest biodiversity, which could be an indicator of function and resilience, then it's important to manage not just for forest, and in particular different age or types of forests, so conifer versus deciduous, oak, hickory, sycamore, whatever it might be, but also grasslands and shrublands, each of them together collectively harboring a much larger grouping of birds. So we might think of some priority birds that we could use as targets. So I've listed some possible ones here. So I mentioned the scarlet tanager and the wood thrush. Both of them are priority birds and need large blocks of forest. The cerulean warbler is a species that's not really found in Lancaster County, but needs large intact forest. It's found north of us, so that could be a target species to manage for. Barred owls need large blocks of forest. Louisiana water thrush I mentioned earlier likes forested stream areas. The ovenbird has where it breeds well in smaller but high quality forest. It has to have a lot of litter because they're ground nesters. And then the Acadian flycatcher needs wet forest. So this covers a wide range of different forest habitats and could be good indicators to manage for, to get baseline conditions now, see how management might change, and then see how they respond. So the last thing I want to talk about before I finish up is what role birds might play in developing some long-term monitoring. The best way to understand the effects of management and to study health is to set out very systematic ways to study various things and then look at change over time. So in addition to the preserves I mentioned, I've been placing these loggers at a variety of other preserves, including Lancaster, F&M's Spalding Conservancy and the new Sunnyside Nature Preserve in downtown Lancaster. And so one next step here is to choose some locations as long-term monitoring and then measure them every year. Now, these acoustic loggers have some downsides. You can't not identify the number of individuals that are found there. And so we've tried to match that out with doing some point counts. And so I've been working, Nikki, I saw that you were on there. So how you doing? And I know I'm slow at getting you an answer, but to try to figure out ways for people to aid this effort by doing point counts. So point counts are when you go, like you can see in the bottom right corner, of someone standing for a set period of time and recording all the birds that they see, noting where the angle that they saw them and the distance that they saw them, and we can use that to extrapolate and estimate density. And so matching that with the recorders can help us validate the recordings that we're getting, but also give us independent data as well, especially if we do it during periods of time when birds aren't singing, like in the fall, spring, and winter. And so we've done a variety of measurements to see how long point counts need to be, and we've come to the conclusion that they're about 10 minutes long. So if any of you are looking for a way to systematically get out into the woods and study birds, please let me know. So another technique that we're expanding the use of is to misnet birds. And so misnetting is a common ornithological technique where you set out a nylon net, presumably in a location where birds are active, but that they can't see. The birds fly into it. You monitor the net so they're not in there for long periods of time. You come, you take them out, you measure, you ban them. Critically important to say that you have to have a permit to do this. So you can't buy a misnet and put these up on your own. But we started misnetting on some of our F&M's property. And so what it's given us is a great sense of not just the density of birds, but species diversity. So occasionally we catch birds that we've never heard or seen. And then by putting bands on their legs, we can study movement. So I've thrown, because everyone loves baby kestrels, I've thrown a cute little baby kestrel in on the right-hand side. So Jeff Musser, who many of you might know from the Lancaster County Solid Waste Authority, has been banding kestrels from kestrel nest boxes for many years. And so we find really interesting information. He bans on my permit, so we do this together, is that these kestrels move to hundreds of kilometers. So bird banding can give us a kind of information that we might not get otherwise. Another important way to study long-term monitoring would be to use observations that everyone makes, what we might call community or citizen science. And so this is just some eBird data. So eBird is a great resource we can download, and we use eBird data to try to validate some of our recordings, but it's a great way to contribute to a larger data set that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology uses. And so this is a map of bobwhite sightings. And so bobwhite seem to be expanding. And one way we know they're expanding is by doing things like catching them and putting on transmitters and following them. But there's only so much money and so much time there is to study bobwhite by following them around. So you can get a huge sample size by people reporting bobwhite sightings just by using something like eBird. So I want to sum up some key points and then open it up for conversation. So the first thing to say is that ecological stewardship is dynamic, that our forests are both responding to external threats, climate change, urbanization, forest fragmentation, and degradation. And so to imagine that leaving, quote, nature alone will allow it to be biodiverse, functional, and resilient is simply just false. In order to hold back these pressures from climate change, urbanization, and habitat loss, we need to actively manage our lands. And so it's important that everyone realizes that stewardship is a dynamic process. It sometimes might look messy or dirty, like if you see a fire or a tree cut in order to knock back invasives or to change the forest dynamics in order to restore or push things towards a more resilient or functional space, we need to be willing to accept that. And so the best way to do that then is to study the pre and post effects as a way to understand that. And so it's important for everyone to realize that the land protection efforts that the Lancaster Conservancy makes are driven by these core ecological principles that trying to think about things like forest block size, interior versus edge, connectivity, are critical pieces of a land management and a land protection strategy. And the last thing to say is that the position of a place matters immensely, that a block of forest that's close to other blocks of forest where animals can move between them and maintain function and genetic diversity, disperse to be able to breed in new places is incredibly important. And patches of forest that are surrounded by what might be an inhospitable matrix of agriculture and development are not nearly as good as habitats that are close to and connected to others. So I did just want to give a call out to the Lancaster Conservancy, both as a statement of thanks for allowing me to collaborate with them and to continue to do work, but also in my 30 plus years as a conservation scientist, I've never worked with a land trust that was more functional and more comfortable with doing exciting, dynamic things, and the capacity for them to take on new projects and to manage new lands is remarkable. So we should all be grateful as community members that we live in a place with such a thoughtful, hardworking land trust. I'm certainly very grateful as a scientist to be able to bring my time, my expertise, and the resources of my college to bear to collaborate with them and ways to understand and apply ecological principles to manage for wildlife and hopefully for the community. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and to take any questions that you might have. So,
Wow, Dan, thanks so much, not just for the presentation, but for the work that you're doing on protected land so that we can make better management decisions, right? I mean, we go into these projects with a good idea of what we think will be the right thing to do ecologically, but it's really great to have the data to back it up and to use that data as part of an adaptive management program instead of just kind of flying by the seat of our pants. We couldn't do without you. And also, thanks for your
yeah.
service on our board. I've been a part of nonprofits my entire adult career, and just to echo what you said, this is by far the most high functioning nonprofit I've ever been a part of. We got a bunch of really great questions. I want to talk about the idea of pat size and minimum pat size related to two different things. So we got a general question about, what's the minimum acreage for a healthy forest?
Wow. I mean, that's a hard question to answer because, like an academic, I'll say, the context matters, but it certainly feels like from the kinds of target species that I mentioned, but from both birds and mammals that, 100 acres or larger would be what would allow for good sustainable populations of many species. And one of the challenges of the measuring the presence of something is that it may be there, but it may not be breeding successfully. And so that requires, really understanding breeding success. And so looking at long-term trends can give us a sense of that. But I would say 100 acres or bigger, all things being equal, is probably a pretty good number for most species. We know for grassland species that might be too big, not because it's not too big for the wildlife, but there just aren't that many places where we could find something that large. But for forests, that seems like a pretty good number. So
Yeah, so speaking of those grassland species, I noticed that you saw meadowlarks out at Safe Harbor over multiple years in that one table that you had up. My understanding is they require a pretty large patch size. I think it's like 75 acres for breeding. Do you think those meadowlarks that you saw are just kind of passing through, or do you think that they're adapting to a smaller patch size?
well, we would love to think they're adapting to a smaller patch size, but they really did seem to be just passing through. We only picked them up intermittently. And so one of the hopes of the changes is that we'll see concerted long periods in which they're there singing. And then we'd love to follow that up with going to look for fledglings. So
Yeah, and it feels like in terms of forest fragmentation that it's a negative feedback loop, right? So that the more you fragment the forest, the more edge you have. And that at least in our part of the world, in my experience, especially on conservancy preserves, that edge keeps expanding because of the invasion of invasives that eliminates forest tree regeneration and regrowth. And so by trying to maintain those large tracts of forested land, which is, you know, the target acreage that we're trying to protect as a land trust, is exactly that, those large forested acres, I think would have a lot of benefit. And to your point about, you know, some of those bird species, we're looking at, you know, 75 acres, 50 acres, I think it was, for the wood thrush, which I think we had three breeding pair here at Climbers last year. So I was pretty happy about that. Other impacts besides fragmentation is the impact on people. And you mentioned that it seems like when the presence of people shifts some of the wildlife behavior and the timing that they're out. I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit more. And I wanted to specifically talk about Sunnyside, right? So for folks that aren't aware, Sunnyside is a 75-acre peninsula in Lancaster City. It's going to become a preserve that's going to be managed by the city, we think. So it's not a conservancy property, but the conservancy is involved. We're doing interpretive events there. We're assisting with making some management recommendations. Dan's doing research out on Sunnyside. It's a really amazing property. But it's off limits to people right now. And so it's got a lot of different abundance and diversity of wildlife. And so one of the questions that we got was, what do you think is going to happen as that property becomes open to the public?
Yeah, I mean, I worry a little because I feel like I've kind of had the place to myself out there for a few years, but of course it's a great urban resource, and I'm excited to see the city residents, especially those in walking distance, use it more. I would say that given that the mammal community is probably not super diverse to begin with, that they'll probably just shift to use different parts of it. From what I'm guessing about where the trails are going to be, there'll be some spaces where they can get away during the day. But I think to your starting point, you know, for preserves that are not very large, when people push animals to use other parts of a preserve that where there aren't trails, then smaller preserves, things will suffer because there'll be less space to go. And I think that's something to really think about. One sort of sublethal effect that we've tried to study over the years is to look at, you know, even though they persist, are they more stressed? And so we've tried to collect, for example, feces or scat to see for foxes or coyotes whether or not that has an effect. So I think that could be an interesting thing to do, to try to get some sort of handful of samples each year to see whether, for example, stress hormones go up as the sort of just amount of activity and disturbance go up as well. So, but
And you know, you mentioned that coyote are on the increase. Do you notice any other trends with some of those other mammals like the gray fox or bobcat?
I mean, it does seem like otters are going up. I mentioned that earlier, that, you know, just from what I hear from people anecdotally who have lived or spent a lot of time along the Conestoga that didn't see them 15 years ago, there seems like there's more. So that's I think an area it would be great to work together to try to place cameras or send posts or varieties of ways to measure otters more targeted across conservancy preserves. Yeah, so that's really the big one, I think.
Mhm.
And as the sort of string of preserves along the Lancaster Lebanon Highlands goes up, as the Conservancy adds little stepping stones, you know, will that increase, for example, movement of bear? And maybe we'll get, you know, young male bobcats or fishers that might be exploring and coming down from the north that maybe won't establish breeding populations yet, but will pick up the presence of them moving through in ways they didn't before. So and I'm sure many of you, sorry, just throw another thought in that, you know, as you drive up 283 going west up towards Harrisburg to the airport, you know, think about that as if you were an animal like a bear moving down from the northeast to the southwest along those highlands, and you were moving towards the Susquehanna River, you have no choice but to cross 283. And so that is a barrier. And 222 does the same thing as you go up towards Reading. And you might notice there's a section of that road near Adamstown where there's about 3 miles of concrete barriers all in a row, which if you were a red fox or a deer or something trying to cross 222, there's nowhere to go but to try to jump over that culvert. I mean, those cement barriers. So when you start thinking about connectivity and landscapes, and I know that you do that a lot, Keith, too, you can really see there's a lot of things that humans could do to facilitate it and a lot of barriers that we put up inadvertently. So.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Anything analogous to reptile herp populations that you're working on that you're aware of?
I would like to say yes, but no, we have not been able to tackle that taxonomic group. It feels like a space that would be great to capture more information. So.
Yep. And then how do you, in the avian work that you're doing, how do you account for migration? You just kind of know the general timing of when things are going to arrive and depart. And a related question is, the Conservancy started a phenology community science program. And we've already, in the 2 years that it's been in existence, have learned some pretty amazing things and have noticed some shifts from what we assume were normal baselines in terms of timing of departures and arrivals and bud burst times. Can you speak to that a little bit? How you're accounting for migrations and shifts that you're noticing?
So I would say that we haven't gotten the recorders up early enough in the year to be able to really comment on that yet, but I really like to get them up earlier. They usually have been gone up around the beginning of May, but that's too late. I mean, some species aren't arriving until later, but I think that would be a really cool, as part of the long-term monitoring piece that I mentioned, it'd be great to talk more about some target places that would be good for long-term monitoring, and then be sure that we were collecting information early enough each year that we could detect things like change in timing, both of arrival and then whether things depart later. Um, and you'd predict, with climate change, that in particular kinds of winters or springs you would see it. So it'd be interesting to see how that's, because it's sort of a moving window, as
Mhm.
wildlife is adjusting to conditions on a fine scale. And so it'd be interesting to see what those effects would be. So
Yeah. So, I look at the predictions on some of the common bird populations like juncos that we have in the wintertime right here, white-throated sparrows, and they're not good. They're birds that are still considered common and globally secure, but they're in decline and predicted to become rare. And then I look at some other birds like kestrels that when I was in college they were super abundant, and then went through a horrible decline. So I was happy that you included the picture of the juvenile kestrel in there on the misnating slide. But I was wondering if you could comment on trends that you've seen in kestrels in our area.
yeah, so I my very first research studies were on kestrels up at Hawk Mountain long ago when I was just starting in grad school. And at the time, they had a very robust, I mean, they still have a nest box breeding program, very agricultural landscape like we have here in Lancaster County, and lots of breeding birds. And then the numbers have been declining for what likely, I think, three reasons. One is just changes in agricultural practices have changed smaller farms that had lots of wood rows and varying habitats to be much larger farms by acreage, which then have less habitat for both breeding and perching. So that, I think, has one effect. I think another effect is just sort of the amount of chemicals that get used on farms have had effects on the prey base. And then there's very strong evidence that migratory birds are, that in the winter are picking up exposure to various chemicals or threats. So kestrel populations are definitely declining.
Yeah. And then what's the biggest surprise that you've discovered?
Goodness me. I mean, well, one thing is one we've talked about before, which is just the high species diversity at places like Sunnyside, where you have species that you So if one starts from the assumption that invasive species are purely bad, and I'm not at all pro invasive species, but if we just start from the idea that a heavily disturbed, highly invasive location will harbor very low species diversity, it turns out some species are still finding ways to use the habitat structure for breeding. And so I think the kind of resilience of some of these smaller patches, not just Sunnyside, but some of the smaller conservancy preserves that are in landscapes where there aren't a lot of other forest options, species are using them because they're the only game in town. And so even though I made the point that lots of connected large habitats are great, these little stepping stones out in agricultural spaces, I think, serve really important functions for migratory birds as they move through, as well as for just harboring wildlife as they move through the landscape. So I think that surprised me a little, that I sort of started with the idea that a 10-acre forest plot surrounded by agriculture would be mostly depauperate, and it turns out they're not. They're quite active.
Yeah, I think sometimes we don't give wildlife and nature enough credit for resilience and adaptability, I think. And I'm
Yeah.
in the same camp with you. I am not an advocate of invasives. I spend a lot of time trying to eliminate them. But at the same time, I think that might be a not the only view. And there might be some more worth to some of those species in certain places than what we give them credit for.
Yeah. So maybe just to add a little to that, I talked about biodiversity, that we should be managing for biodiversity function and resilience. And sometimes we can get function and resilience with a low biodiversity. So it doesn't mean we should accept low biodiversity, but if we have systems that show a lot of function and are resilient, then we should be grateful and try to find ways to manage to maintain that, even if they don't harbor as many species. So
Yeah, and we got a question about community science opportunities with the Conservancy, and you're really laying the foundation for that in a lot of ways, Dan. So we've got two ways that people can get involved with us with community science. One is phenology. We've got phenology training coming up on January 24th. Kelly just put the link to the sign up for that in the chat. Phenology tracks the timing of things. When do things arrive? When do they depart if they're migratory? If they are not migratory, when and they're a plant, when do they leaf out? When do they leaf fall, etc. And then we're also working on developing a butterfly monitoring program and a bird monitoring program. And Dan's working with two master naturalists now as part of their project to do some point count surveys that are going to back up some of the auditory data that you're collecting. And so we expect our community science volunteer program to include phenology, some avian component, some kind of a butterfly component, and then also we work with the Soil and Water Conservation District to host volunteers that go out and do water quality monitoring every month, which provides really important data to help us funnel very limited resources in stream restoration. So stay tuned for more information about the emerging community science program that's going to be part of the Conservancy's volunteer efforts. Thanks again, Dan. Really amazing work that you're doing, and thanks for presenting it in such a engaging way. Our next Nature Hour, How to Love a Forest with award-winning author Ethan Tapper, will be on January 22nd. If you don't know Ethan Tapper, check him out. He's got an amazing presence on social media. He's a forester based in New England. Really thoughtful way of looking at forest history and restoration. And I'm excited that we were able to have Ethan join us on the 22nd. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great evening.
good night. Thanks again, Keith.